recording. Sorry, just a second. Someone is knocking.
I can hear you, but I can't respond because you didn't do the
job
as moderators or participants.
Sure, I'll make you moderator, and then if you could help me in just checking the chat box, we make sure we receive everyone's questions. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Tanya. All right, perfect. I just need to make Tanya moderator here. Sorry. Just a second. Okay, perfect. All right, we might start. Good day, everyone, or maybe I should say good night, because it is 9 p.m. now in Boston, where Nader is joining us. It's with great pleasure to host not only one, but two worldly architects, Nader Tehrani and John Wardle, as part of our ongoing Architalks series. Well, I understand that people are much busier these days trying to, manage their meetings and commitments online. So Nader and John have been incredibly generous with their time, and we really thank them for their time and presence. So Nader Tehrani is founding principal of NADAAA, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry. He's also Dean of the School of Architecture at the Cooper Union in New York City, and his work has been recognized with notable awards. Nader is the recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters 2020 Arnold Brunner Memorial Prize. Throughout his career, Nader has received 18 Progressive Architecture Awards, as well as numerous national and international design awards. He served as the Gehry International Visiting Chair in Architectural Design at the University of Toronto and the inaugural Paul Helmle Fellow at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. He also recently served as the Bernoudy Architect in residence at the American Academy in Rome, and his office, NADAAA, for the past 7 years in a row, has ranked in the top 11 design firms in Architecture magazine, top 50 firms in the United States, ranking as first 3 years in a row. That is really impressive. I would also like to thank John Wardle to join us today. John's works are quite well known for us, including his impressive design for our new School of Design and the Built Environment. So as I guess most of you participants know, John Wardle Architect has studios in Sydney and Melbourne. John is attuned to the importance of detail. He believes that it is through the details that the nature of material, the fit to function, and the experience of occupation is expressed. And I guess this is the reason why Nader and John can create stunning works like Melbourne School of Design together. John Wardle has an international reputation as a design architect. The work of JWA is tailored to place and highly experiential in nature. Diverse in scale and typology, the firm's portfolio spans domestic dwellings, university buildings, museums, and large commercial offices. The practice has now won national and international awards of education, residential, and civic design, and John was honored in 2020 with the gold medal, the Australian Institute of Architects' highest individual distinction. In 2018, John Wardle Architects was recognized with the RIBA Award for International Excellence. Well, not sure if I could actually introduce the two architects well enough in such a short time, but I definitely encourage you to visit NADAAA and JWA websites and see, their amazing works, which are really incredible. So when I contacted Nader to present his design philosophy and NADAAA, he made a great suggestion, and that was having a conversational talk rather than a monologue. So he suggested John to make sure he received, I guess, enough challenging questions and comments. I guess Nader will present the tectonic grain talk, and then John will then join us in the conversation. And of course, everyone is welcome to ask questions and participate in the discussion afterwards. So if I may ask John to say hello, and then we just hand it over to Nader for the talk. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Parisa. Yes, well, hello, Nader. Good evening to you, and welcome to
Good evening. Good morning.
Two opposite parts of our great continent. I'm speaking in Melbourne, and the rest of your audience is all in Western Australia. Or presumably they are. I'm not sure. I imagine.
Well, some of them are joining from US and Canada as well.
Right, okay, we're spanning every part of two hemispheres, and that's a good thing, and that's really been the basis of our relationship. We learnt when we first assigned ourselves to the task of the two practices coming together to span both the span of time and place and work together on projects that are very much set in their locality. So for us, this idea of a conversation that spans two hemispheres is a continual conversation, and one that we've enjoyed greatly over many, many years, and we keep seeking opportunities to further that. So through these sorts of talks, but also hopefully more project work up ahead. And I'll probably touch on some of our appreciation of the way Nader operates his practice, particularly in some of the questions that I'll ask at the end of Nader's talk. So welcome, Nader, to your audience from many parts.
Thank you. So before I begin, I just want to thank John, not only for his generosity tonight, for becoming an interlocutor in this conversation, but for over 10 years of collaboration. He is the reason why we were set foot in Australia to begin with over 10 years ago. I will not show the Melbourne School of Design. I assume everybody has seen that. And I will just briefly present the Tenderham Bridge, because I will try to bring a perspective to that project, which is partly fictional, but an important part of the narrative nonetheless. And maybe that's something that John and I can hash out a little bit later as we go into ways in which we think of our works. Let me start sharing the screen, because I also enter this discussion with the presumption that everybody has access to YouTube. You've all seen many of all of our works, and so really the conversation should be more important than getting the usual presentation. So I will have all of this material available for John to tap into, but I will present episodes within each project as key episodes, as it were, important narratives, and then we can come back to them in the conversation if and when necessary. So really my intent is just not to talk more than 20-25 minutes, and I'll present what is ostensibly a very simple concept, what I call the tectonic grain, which deals with this notion of construction, something that I believe we share intimately with John's office, and it is this relationship that we set up between the part and the whole of architecture. It's constructive elements, it's units on the one hand, and the larger figures that bring it all together. In the context of nature, we also understand that the zebra is a figure much like the horse or a donkey, but what makes it unique is its striping, and that striping produces this camouflage that makes it concealed in the context of the savanna. Now, it's only upon closer inspection that you realize that the striping is wrong, because we all know that the striping is perpendicular to not only the torso but also the legs, and the architecture is in the turning of those corners. And when I say turning of those corners, I'm thinking architecturally here, like Palladio or Mies. But underscoring the idea that architects operate within a realm not of nature, but rather of artifice. We are making materials do what they don't want to do, contrary to what the ethicists might claim, that we force things, we will things onto conditions that are in a way highly unnatural, and that's what it means to be an architect. In the context of the Tenderem Bridge, and don't ask me to remember who said what, and so I will maybe safely attribute everything that's good to John and everything that's flawed to myself. But at some point, we had this fascination about working with a raw structure whose structural premise is rooted in the idea of redundancy, and the rebar became the vehicle by which to do this. And what I enjoyed about that was it was this idea that you can not only connect to the Rod Laver Stadium at the kind of urbanistic level, at the city level, connecting to the Yarra River, but recognizing that the experience from above is really active 2 weeks of the year. The rest of it all has to do with what I call the fifth facade, or the reflected ceiling plan, the belly of this thing, because that's the facade onto the park. And understanding that one enters into the discussion with rebar and its proclivities by understanding how its manufacturing process, its bending process, gains the possibility of deformation, shaping, and different formalisms. By doing that, we also understand the filigree that is part and parcel of that belly, capturing, as it were, the figure of the maximum moment in the center. It's really like a pediment turned upside down. And then notice in the precedents underneath that there's always a hierarchy between the structural members and those which are in tension. We imagined in our minds, what would it mean if the rebar conspired all together through redundancy, braided on the longitudinal and lateral axis to span through accumulation of members. Something of course that is formidable and unsurmountable, but nonetheless a narrative that I've held on to for all this time, with the idea that that belly is able to wrap the railings, the guards, and eventually the lighting that comes into dialogue with the skyline of Melbourne beyond. But what is important for us is this dialogue between this constructed horizon, essentially the underworld belonging to the park and the everyday life, and that which is above, which is for these great events. This idea of graining, as it were, the grain of the rebar, the tectonic grain of steel, is interpreted in altogether a different way on this house that we're in the middle of fabricating right now. We have a big part in building it because it's part of our commitment to build the entire interiors, and it's rooted in the premise of the shotgun house, which you see from New Orleans above left. And this idea that the enfilade of the shotgun essentially eliminates circulation. In our own diagrams below, you can see the kind of the step logic of a house that has a bedroom, it has a guest bedroom, a corridor, and then it slowly gets larger as it goes into the living room. And in dialogue with the clients, we realized that there is somewhere in this a more pure diagram, which is a diagram of two diagonals. One diagonal between what we call the poché space and the public space. The poché is all of the private spaces of the bedrooms, the library, the bathrooms, and the kitchens, and the public space is that of the dining, living, and the space of the view. And then the opposite diagonal is really in response to a roof which runs in the opposite way. Conceptually then, the transformation of this type is in search of a form of purity, something that holds the vestiges of a very traditional type, but nonetheless in the diagonal produces a clear diagram that sets in motion the figure of the house itself. With all of the water of the roof being collected into a cistern on the opposing side. The cornice line of this house on the west side and on the south is a strict 14 feet. And so that's the tall side, with everything of the roof descending down from that direction in two perspectives. One is the diagonal of the wall, which runs through the living room and then subsequently through the kitchen, through the entryway, through the library, and then finally and eventually into the bedroom where it's completely private. And of course the roof is doing exactly the opposite as it goes into a kind of oblique perspective, one going in one direction and one going, it's a kind of cross-eyed view of that space. This is an image of the framing a couple of months ago before we started our millwork. We eventually built out the roof with LVLs without the diagonal, only doing it does effectively a similar geometry, but without the long beam on the diagonal axis. The graining of this project remains very important for us because we effectively do not conceal any of the structure, and so it becomes a central part of its conceptualization. You see the seams on the roof as much as you see the revealed beams on the interior. The floorboards participate in this graining, and that grain extends into the porch on one side and into the deck on the other side. So the diagonals effectively begin to splay out and engage the landscape in both directions. It's essentially a pattern, but the pattern has a morphological impact on the house itself. And then, of course, the cistern that collects all the water and engages the landscape. Here you see it again under construction. There are moments of stasis and proto-symmetry. So here you can see on the southern axis, for instance, the ways in which the chimney produces a center while it's actually on the edge of the house, with the porch opening onto the other side. This is just before it's put up. But that effectively, it's the idea of the house is very much a house in the raw. I mean, it's built under $300 a square foot, which is a central part of its alibi. So with that in mind, this notion of graining takes on a slightly different level of complexity in the Adams Library. What we are also building right now, a project that is very participatory in nature, beyond the kinds of collaborations that we've done with John. This is one of those situations where you're collaborating with an entire community, with children, adolescents, adults, and many people of the community, to develop a strategy in a small neighborhood on a main street that acknowledges the civic realm on the main street while breaking down to the granular scale of each of the houses in the backyard. The logic of the building is then very simple at first. A large pitched roof, monumental and civic in its nature in the front, breaks up in the back with pitched roofs that in a way mirror the scale of the residence, and that produces a modulation in the roof, helping the water to come out in a garden in the back. We open up a court in the south to bring in light to this deep plan, and then frame an existing tree to the north as a consequence. The grain is then set forth in the shelving that is in the library, but also in the beams that are revealed in the cross grain. Much like the house in Connecticut, the expression of this library is all about the rawness of a space that is revealed overhead, the fifth facade, as it were, that undulates like a flying carpet as you walk underneath and through it, framing the large oak tree to the north. And so there's several ideas around this that I won't speak to in great detail, but obviously the references to different architectural histories are in a way resonant in this instance, monumentalizing the front while acknowledging the kind of diminutive necessities of the back side. And we're using a terracotta tile for the construction of its skin, something that we drew upon from this very strange tradition in New England. I haven't really seen it elsewhere, but it comes from these buildings that are called brick-sided structures. And effectively they are, it's the result of a kind of Yankee pragmatism, whereby the civic front in either marble or in white paint, clapboard, is then rotates to the side elevation where the brick serves as a kind of party wall or a firewall against the neighbors, or just a cheaper wall with, clapboard siding on the side with brick on the front. There's something rather unceremonious about the turning of that corner. It's almost as if two buildings were collaged together in a way that defies everything that we've been taught in notions of synthesis in school. And so this building comes together in a combination of raw, unadulterated terracotta on one side, a glazed white terracotta for the front facade, and this ribbed black, almost eggplant terracotta on the sides and the back, coming together in those distinct moments on the edges. The reading garden is a major public component of this project, and it serves to really bring the community together, as the library is used in fundamentally different ways than it might have been in the pre-internet era. So I'm going to jump on to other projects. We can always come back to this, particularly if you want to go to the mock-up sections and things like that to talk about construction. But I want to talk a little bit now about the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, a building that I'll go through, I guess, relatively fast. But it's a project that comes right after the Melbourne School of Design. We had the opportunity to do the Georgia Tech School of Architecture, and then under the guidance of John, MSD. And so we put a lot of that thinking into a very different circumstance here on Spadina Circle, where Knox College was an existing neo-Gothic building with a spire that they wanted celebrated and preserved, with an addition of a grand great hall and studio space that would be submissive in some way and blend in with the landscape as we open up a northern face to Spadina Circle, but also these carved spaces, these urban spaces and courtyards that activate the urban space around it. Knox College is a very simple U-shaped building, and we sort of took the momentum of that building to complete it, as it were, and give it a north facade for the first time, with its cores aptly placed on the corners. But more interestingly, instead of using the symbolic fronts in the south and the north as the main entries, we recognize that their urban connection to the city is actually lateral on the east and the west. And so we introduce a street into the building, a pedestrian street that is open 24/7. And something that maintains the north and the south as having a kind of symbolic importance, but really ultimately activate the plazas on the side as the basis for the street that becomes the life of the building. It has the lockers there, the cafe, a view through the Fab Lab, a peer into the studios, but ultimately a public space that everybody has access to. And though it's a massive, matte and blocky building, it's very much a piece of landscape urbanism, in the sense that all of the spaces engage the ground of the outside, underneath, above, and on grade, ascending slowly to the grand studio space that is on top of the building, where the ultimate folded landscape is revealed in the roof. And this roof was a topic of much anxiety for the school, because they didn't believe that it was somehow possible to build. The core of the building is also the main common space around which everything happens. The grand hall that gains its indirect light from the studio space on the right and crit spaces on the left. You can close all of those spaces, but it's an ornate interior with a parallax of colors that are available to the eye as one walks around the circumference of this space, usually in the dark, and then as it gets illuminated, you get to see these colors, whereas the rest of the building is fundamentally neutral and white. But the connection this hall has is diametrically opposed to traditional auditoria. It's more porous, it's more accepting of the audiences that are in its periphery, so that when there are grand lectures, people leak out, and beyond, it connects back to the city. That same bleacher system connects back to Spadina North, and the city looks straight into the studio space and the Fab Lab here, and gets reconnected by way of indoor-outdoor work that gets done through the Fab Lab, connecting back to the main street, as it were, and the cafe as one goes back into the building. And so there's something about the urbanism of this building that is deeply embedded in the logic of the Melbourne School of Design also, for those of you who've already seen that. The connection then to the design studio is very important. There's a carded entry that you can go up as a student up bleacher space that finally connects you with a grand prospect, with a kind of open crown hall space that overlooks Spadina Circle. The signature space of this building is this space, and what we fought for and what the contractors told us was unbuildable, and so we built a model of it, and they told us how wonderful the model was, but that they're building buildings, they're not building models. And so this is $1 million over and unaffordable, essentially. And we had not thought the fabrication through. So knowing that there was something amiss in their calculations, I instructed the office to start building one of the leaves of this roof in our studio space to examine how it works. And because we'd studied many of these candela structures, ruled surfaces, concrete folded structures, shells, and we knew it was possible. We just didn't know what their will was to collaborate with us. Ultimately, it was too expensive to do it as a concrete building, so we shifted it from a concrete structure to a stick-built structure, showed them that there's no compound curvatures in there, it's just ruled surfaces, and that the plaster is not a regular sheetrock. It's actually a radiant panel that cools the building. So the heating happens in the concrete of the ground, but the cooling happens in the radiant panel from above. So one is sandwiched in this space using a steel structure that effectively allows you to build it in half the time with half the complexity than it would had it been in concrete. So the steel, a kind of low resolution ruled surface, the radiant panels going up, the painting of them, and effectively a roof line that begins to reflect a logic of the Gothic, not the image of the Gothic, in the way that the spanning reflects three conditions. One, the long span folded structure in dialogue with a daylighting strategy and in dialogue with all of the hydrology of the building being pushed aside down the sideburns of this building and into a cistern that will then irrigate the landscape around the site. And so this space for us is emblematic of an architecture that can do several feats at one time, and that's what effectively makes it that roof essentially the sixth facade. It reads from the air, it reads from the reflected ceiling plan, and it is its signature piece. For those of you who know MSD, you also understand its resonant position in the middle of that space. It recalls the way in which the Tempietto, a miniature folly, is incarcerated inside this monastic court. It recalls the kind of odd figure of Gehry's in Berlin, where the fabric that he creates is rather generic around it, but the figure is rather weird and zoomorphic. And in the middle, you see the way in which Kahn struggles to transform a generic stair into an iconic totem, a column, as it were, whose tectonic logic finds a way to frame the building at large while allowing the wood to create the character of the gallery inside. What John and I were interested in doing in MSD was to develop a roof structure whose generic logic also has the capability for figurative freedom and liberty to transform, to give it lateral stability by sticking to the sides, by gaining a kind of inverted logic because it's suspended by being thick, deep, and fat at the top, while getting skinnier and skinnier in suspension as it hangs down over the space of the interior. The skin expresses the grain of the ceiling, as it were, but the veneer is also expressed as it goes down. The massiveness of those coffers are turned 90 degrees down in the paneling system as monoliths, but as they go down, the logic that goes from the massive to the veneer also gets expressed in the morphology of the rooms, as well as in the veneers of the acoustic paneling that is suspended underneath. Something we can talk about later, but this fascination with top-down and bottom-up thinking resides in a logic that is very much at work in all of our architecture. The bowl and the nest being virtually the same thing, whereas the bowl erases the markings of its construction. The aggregate within it is essentially erased, whereas the nest foregrounds the importance of the twigs and the blades of grass as the elements that allow the figure to be built, and therefore to be built in different figures and different shapes and forms. And we like the freedom that the right side gives. And so to end now, I'm going to very quickly show how these projects in sum total contribute to a very simple courtyard house in southern France that is in an opulent neighborhood, nonetheless very dense, that requires a kind of privacy by virtue of two wings at the top that conceal the inner court, and a slippage in section that allows both the top and the bottom floor to get views of the Mediterranean, with a swimming pool that is nestled in between. The logic of this house has to do with the way in which it responds to the geometry of the site, the grand view of the Mediterranean, but also the smaller views of the context as you peek out windows. Its ability to deform under the weight of the section of the site as it slopes, the conjoinment of the two L wings on the corners with stairs, and most importantly, the introduction of the landscape, not around the building, but in and through the building as it builds a dialogue all around the house. And so here now built in a kind of monolithic concrete, that promenade becomes embodied in this sequence that is an alternative way of just coming up and into the house from the outside. Here, the upper wing, you can see the living room area and the master wing above, with the slippage down looking through the crack of that landscape in the swimming pool below. And then the formal entry is actually on the side. The front facade is actually not a facade, it's a beam that allows for that cantilever to happen. The entry, which is a kind of incision into that beam, and then finally the access into the space reveals somewhat of a case study house, a glass box whose asymmetry contributes in the way in which one experiences the site. In fact, the vaults on top of the house open up to the western sun and allow for cross breezes in the summer months. It's a dramatic site with Pinus Pinei behind it, with 20-foot cuts into the landscape, with the views looking up at the belly of the Pinus Pinei being quite dramatic. The folded roof is in dialogue, obviously, with a longer experiment we've been having now with the Daniels Building, with certainly with Melbourne and the Adams Library, but a logic that brings the edge of the building and its daylighting in dialogue with a structural system that supports these two wings embedded within the logic of the type. Structure and the type of the courtyard are somehow embedded in a circulatory system that looks back into the pool. And so the lower wing accesses the bedrooms on one side, but the swimming pool on the opposite side. The logic of the bedrooms then is about layering, how levels of darkness and lightness, privacy, security, and shade are essentially achieved by a series of laminar layers that open you up towards the landscape. On the one hand, we want you to be open with an unmitigated relationship to the landscape. On the other hand, we want you to feel absolutely secure within it. Going back to the discussion of the tectonic grain, this is also the first building that we've done where concrete is its most expressive medium. And we tested two modalities of construction that were never ultimately built, but I think is important for this talk. And it's this idea that unlike bricks and stones and wood, concrete is a liquid medium, so its expression is either reliant on the formwork a priori or bush hammering a posteriori. And so we thought of one system of fabric formed concrete work where an element of dynamism is introduced in the face by virtue of a rusticated surface that billows out of that concrete work as one walks into the entry. Ultimately, a very representational strategy, and we shied away from it because we wanted to focus on a strategy that had more to do with the constitution of the core of the wall by way of its aggregates. So the second strategy we looked at was actually looking at this dimension of the aggregates in each cast panel becoming slightly larger each and every time, such that by the time you get to the landscape wall, it is merely a rock wall using the concrete as a mortar to hold it together. And so this transition from the smooth to the rusticated happens over the length of 20, 30 feet. The ultimate result, of course, is that budget, price, circumstance takes over, but that the earthen hues of the landscape, that orangish red, becomes a major agent in giving character to that wall. And most importantly, the sandblasted nature of that surface draws out the wood grain in that same surface, producing what is the Villa Varoise. So with that, if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is open up the discussion about the tectonic grain to John. And I'm happy, John, to continue to share the screen if you want to refer to certain images, or ultimately, if you prefer to have a face-to-face talk, I can stop sharing altogether. John?
Thanks, Nader.
Oh.
I think he should be there. Yep.
Yeah. Good. Now, Parisa, I think also you have some questions, but yeah, thank you so much, Nader. I've got a series of things I'd like to ask, but Parisa, did you want to, I think you had a couple of thoughts you wanted to open up the questions with?
Yeah, that would be great. I would like to ask, I would like to start with a question about the details, but I guess the comments I would like to make first is that basically whenever I watch Nader's talks, I really tend to re-watch them and review them because the talks are so rich and full of, you know, intricacies and details. So I really feel that I need to watch them again. So the question is also related to that. Nader, why are you interested in microscopic details as an architect, and how has that originated in you? When did that originate in you?
I'm not sure when it originated, but it obviously the question of the detail came in quite strongly in our own education in studying Mies and many other architects of that ilk, from Mies to Scarpa, very different modalities of thinking. But if you think about it, in Scarpa, the detail has a kind of rarefied function. It is individuated, it's extraordinary, it brings unprecedented conditions together, whereas in Mies, it is universal, it is generic, and it is constant in the way that it builds on a vocabulary. But in school, you're always taught that, the detail is the last destination of architecture. You develop the architecture and then at the end you detail it. What we like are those moments when a detail has the capacity to inform the morphology of a house. And so here I show the graining of plywood in this instance, and how that graining north-south has this impact on a reading of the building that shows how the party walls are having the same grain as the plywood itself. In this instance, the graining of that plywood has a significant way of organizing the house itself, because it is solid on one axis and porous on the other, and with reason, because the north-south axis is always porous and public, and so you bring the light from the south all the way to the north, and you gain visibility from the public street all the way to the garden. But contrary, when you look to the private areas of the kitchen and bedrooms and family rooms, we don't even have doors. We have wall panels that slide and completely conceal them in these long panels. So this explains a moment where the detail is actually catalytic. It informs the architecture rather than become the result of it after the fact.
That's great, Nader. Thank you. John, would you like to continue?
Yes, look, I probably have some questions that maybe span more the processes that are drawn together over a series of your projects. There is a fascination with the detail that is about craft. Now, craft has traditionally had a sort of a humanistic aspect. It's the hand of the maker, or the craftsmanship, craftsman-built buildings. With the fabrication and your intrigue in assembly, the process of assembly, it almost appears out of almost the digital platforms that you create much of your work, a new form of craftsmanship. But is it in your mind now the craftsmanship of pure fabrication, or is there still a fascination with the holders of the craft and its traditions and cultural aspects of craft and identity to regions and things like that? Because we can now, with the platforms we work, actually devolve that link between craft and a location or cultural patterns and so forth. So in your work, this craft and this assembly and architecture that comes out of a sense of fabrication, where do you still see the place of craft in that, and the definition of craftsmanship or craftspersonship?
I think it's a good question, and there's many ways of possibly answering it. I think that my strategic answer to that is that precisely because the majority of the context in which we've worked doesn't have any remnants of traditional craft left, we rely not on craft, but on tolerance and on latitude to gain extra latitude from generic details to push tectonics to their possible limits. In that sense, often what we do is that we do not shop out a designed building to go out to bid at the end of CDs or even DVDs. What we do is that we develop a dialogue very early on in the schematic design process with steel workers, with masons, and with mill workers, trying to ask them what do they do as a common practice, and what are their preferred techniques, and how might we yield out of that a logic for our buildings. What you're looking at here is the recently built RISD dormitories, the face that is on the south on Waterman Street, and the ways in which the patterning of these bonded brickworks, they're all slightly different. I don't know if you're seeing that closely enough. Is the result of a almost a collage of sliding panels that they said they could do with a level of fidelity to the notion of a precast, preformed brick panel that would be fabricated off-site and then brought to the site and lifted into place. And so we're dealing with hybrid situations, sometimes with, at RISD's library, inaugurating plaster processes that are virtually obsolete to bring old craft back into it. In situations like this with the brick, we are dealing with the odor of the ornate brick facades of Providence, but using contemporary techniques of prefabrication to do that with. And then in moments like this, for instance, in MIT, knowing the scale and the magnitude of industrial production of a high-rise tower, how can we take almost corporate systems to their maximum yield? And in this case, we were looking at the different anodization processes of aluminum to develop an accelerated sense of height for the building by way of developing a larger portfolio of lightnesses and darknesses in the panelization of this of this building. And so you can see how it goes from dark to light as it ascends. So much of this detailing has to do with a direct appeal, not so much to traditional craftsmen, but the way that the industry has internalized possibilities of fabrication in today's world. Again, none of what I'm showing right now are digitally motivated. I would say that your reference to the digital becomes evident in, I don't know if I have it here or not, but like Bank Restaurant, earlier years. I'm not sure if I have that here. I thought I had it, but you know, some of this type of work certainly has that, you know, the element of digitally crafted work. In fact, this building in Washington, D.C. had such a bad contractor that what we did is that we teamed up with a mill worker to take over the sum total of the interior and hide all of the bad work that was underneath it. And so it turned out to be a rather extraordinary crafted interior, because all of that digital work went into making very precise tolerances for what was otherwise a very shoddy construction underneath, giving it a kind of precise resonance that a building like this would never have afforded otherwise. I'm not sure if this answers your question,
yeah,
but
it does. And having visited, yeah, no, it does. But also having visited your studio, it is this sort of shifting definition, because in some of these projects you've also been completely instructive. I mean, you virtually have a fab lab in the ground floor of your studio. You do actually assemble your own maquettes or assembly of prototypes.
That's
and
correct.
things. And I think it's a fascination with making that it is shifting the nature of craftsmanship. I do have another question, because I'm not sure how time's going, but with the Adams Library, it was interesting because there you have a civic building in the midst of what to me appeared to be a completely domestic neighbourhood. And we often think about how the civic structure has to refer and find comfort in a domestic setting by appreciating the detail of domestic architecture. In a way, there's possibly way more intensity and detail in your library than actually is in any of the homes that surround it. And I just wonder whether there is something, this aspect of the community, working in a community building, that is instructive or should be inspirational in your mind to those that will experience it. So it's not really that taking its detail intensity necessarily from the houses, because to me it's almost amplifying that level of acute detail that we may experience in a domestic setting. Is there something there that's almost pedagogical or instructive in a civic building in your mind?
Well, certainly yes, but I'll also remind you that the domestic structures of that neighborhood are highly crafted and textured. They are shingled buildings, there are clapboard buildings, there are shiplap buildings, all of them usually in wood. And then there are some very well-detailed brick buildings that are the high schools and some of the other sort of civic buildings. Obviously, the kind of morphology of the building refers to, some of the McKim, Mead, and White and Venturi structures, which have this kind of horizontal monumentality. But the references to, the vertical siding and the board and batten and all of that is a transformation, in this case, of the fluting of the Doric order unrolled here, as it were, capturing the sunlight as it goes from the south to the west elevation. This fluting that you see is a constant in the patterning of this facade. You'll see that at slightly different scales. It is not an immediate reflection of the residences around you, because for the most part, they're horizontal siding, not vertical, but it is an oblique reference to the kind of classicist orders of their high schools, libraries, and civic buildings at large, which usually are in brick or in terracotta. So there is this element of acknowledgement here that it's not business as usual. It's something different. When you look at these images of the brick-sided buildings, you somehow come to appreciate the jarring difference between the civic and the domestic, not only in the scaling of the front and the side, but also in that materiality that comes into absolute zero lot line detailing at the edges. And our building is doing that somehow with its context also.
Thanks, Nader and John. Can I just interrupt because we have two questions in the chat box. If you don't mind, I'll just read Baron's question. So this is an amazing presentation. Could you elaborate on the design process in terms of how a project is approached?
So if you connect this question with Parisa's original question about detail, it's not uncommon that we may start the line of questioning about a project in three modalities. We'll be working on a detail without knowing what the shape of the building is, but just by elaborating details in our mind as calisthenics. But while we're doing that, we're doing a whole range of urban analyses, like what you're looking at here, about site forces, infrastructural needs, emergency exits and necessities like this, all the while sometimes studying really basic needs of, building organization and typologies. In this instance, it has to do with, the fundaments of servicing an apartment building. Where do you have the lowered ceilings? Where do you have the higher ceilings? How do you get natural ventilation? And how do you get the maximum out of units? So in short, what we're doing three scales at one time without the anxiety of how it reconciles. We allow them to run into certain and demonstrable conflicts. And then the architecture begins in that moment when you're trying to reconcile those three moments all in one.
Thanks. Thank you, Nader. Anyone in the audience would like to basically turn on the microphone and ask any question? I just thought I'd open it to the audience. I still have one more question in the chat box. Zebra, could you say your tectonic grains have relationship with zebra's grain only or with all natural grain? Is it an architectural theory? I guess this is Nader's theory, really. Yep, over to you, Nader.
I mean, look, the zebra is, the only real zebra in the room is number 2. All of the other zebras are not as zebras. So the zebra for me is an allegorical figure, recognizing that with every decision that we make about drawing a line, we're not actually so much drawing a line out of pictorial necessity. The line represents for us a fabricated entity. And so drawings are fabricated as much as buildings are fabricated. For me, the grain, the striping of that zebra is an indication that the constitution of its hair, every blade of hair, every filament is a way of creating meaningful relationships between parts and wholes. We recognize that there are extraordinary architects who suppress constructive articulation. I mean, one of my favorite architects is Caesar, and what I love about his work is the relative muteness of that work and the way that he has flattened all expression to almost plaster, stucco, and stone. But our path of research has led us into a kind of ingrained materiality whereby the textures are a central part of the way in which we understand and come to terms with the very context in which these buildings get placed and how they negotiate history and contemporariness. I mean, part of our predicament in today's world is that we precisely don't build with heavy walls. We build with absolutely thin walls. And coming to terms with thinness is a great part of our challenge. And so I guess the metaphor of that zebra has to do with an ethic that we ingrain in the part-to-whole relationship.
Thanks, Nader. I think I'm going to make Maziar as a moderator. So if you have your microphone on, you can ask your questions, Maziar. Or you might prefer I read your question. So
okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was trying to figure out this system, this platform, the first time I'm using that. Okay, it's just a quick question. Thanks, Nader, for the great presentation. I was just wondering how you convince your clients to care about details which you care about, and you know, eventually pay for them. That's you know, that's maybe more critical when your clients are for residential projects, probably. But in general, if you could talk about that, that would be great. Thanks.
So the majority of the work I've shown today is institutional work and public work, and all of those have very stringent budgets that are bid on and constrained by convention. I would say that this house here, as well as the concrete house, represents a kind of diametrically opposed relationship with the industry, in the sense that these are highly customized and relatively expensive buildings. And so the expectations of those residences is a level of you know, detail, perfection, opulence, if I can use that word, but you know, a level of attention that goes beyond the ordinary. It's harder actually to get this kind of detail out of public buildings, institutional buildings, to allow them to gain a higher level of finesse. I would say that the Melbourne School of Design was significant for us, in part not because of what John and Nader did together, but its dean, Tom Cavan, framed the project as a pedagogical building, and how a building's mission needs to be able to not only house a teaching structure, but to become didactic in the way that it works. And so having done Georgia Tech and then subsequently Toronto, we've also developed this ethic as a way of presenting all of our buildings, that the building should find ways to engage its audiences by helping them to understand the building itself, by teaching them in a certain way, and in a way the details interpolate you as a subject. They they call you out to act on them, and they speak back to you. And so there's an element of that detail that speaks to subjectivity and affect also. The ways that something like this detail, which is flat, gains such depth 2 times a day as the sun passes around it, and where the shadows become quite volatile. So I think that you may be seeing a cost and an expense that is just not there. The bigger question is, how do you get generic, economical, and cheap buildings to do the extraordinary? And the answer to that really resides in the work of John Wardle, I would say. I mean, if you ask me what are the lessons you learned from John, it has to do with these great industrial sheds that look like Swiss jewels. And they have to do with a scaling and a finesse of the way in which not only elements of craft, but elements of perception are embedded into them. Skins that are diaphanous, relationships between interiors and exteriors, and knowing what needs to be tactile and what needs to be optical. There's certain things you touch, and there's other things that you don't touch, you let the sun touch them, and the shadows do the rest of the work for you.
I would add to that answer to your question. I think also what you're witnessing here is that aspect of what we do as architects, the amount of time and endeavour in advocating for our ideas. And Nader, as you've witnessed, is a master at that. There's an extraordinary proportion of our creative capacity is devoted to as convincing others. Whether it be the tradespeople on the site, the head contractor, the dean of the faculty, the client in any forms, that process of advocacy and having to be convincing is something that to do anything of this level of worth, you have to commit to. I mean, I had the pleasure of walking through Yale with Nader some years ago and seeing Louis Kahn's remarkable gallery space, and the stories we hear of Kahn are remarkable stories of advocacy. He is a kind of a more eccentric out-of-towner. There's stories of him advocating to clients, so some of the great stories of architecture. I think it's another interesting aspect to what we do, and Nader is completely instructive with this aspect of how we create and then how we have to advocate what we create. I think it's a fascinating part of an architectural education.
Great. Thanks, John. We have a comment from Rayan. Hi, Nader. Thank you for the amazing presentation. Really enjoyed all of your projects. I think there are lots of thank yous and commendations here for you, Nader, and John. And I'm a bit conscious of time. This was really inspiring presentation, and I guess we can see that there are still 42 participants, and it's 10:16 now. We usually have less than 2-3, when we exceed the timing. But thank you so much. I think we're really lucky to have you both here today, and I'm really grateful that you accepted our invite. I don't know whether John or Nader wants to basically have a kind of closing sentence. Please do if you have.
Look, I just want to.
Good.
Go ahead, John. You go first.
No, you say something. I had a little final thought, momentary thought I might add to conclude.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wanted to round out the comment that John just made about advocacy, that so much of what we do in architecture is collaborative that communication becomes a hinge point of almost every endeavor that we undertake. That communication happens through drawings, through models, through mock-ups, but also there's a slippery territory where, you know, these representations and words come into kind of another form of dialogue and slippage with each other. And sometimes they don't match, but the narrative and the fiction that you overlay is sometimes quite slippery, but also very important because it opens up other avenues for clients and collaborators to enter into that design process, not by way of the form that they see, but the associations that are built up through those fictions. And I think it's important that architecture doesn't close down interpretation. It keeps opening up other ways of being interpreted and seen. And I guess those are the buildings and the architectures that I fall in love with, is that they keep revealing something slightly different each time. And obviously I've already thanked John for being here, but I haven't really done justice to the work we did together, because it was so much rooted in a deep and profound appreciation of certain explorations and tests that he had already undertaken long before us, that are built and are not only works of academic precision, which is already a feat in and of itself, but you know you're in the presence of architecture when it is able to seduce you at a physical level. It is able to transport you into an almost irrational state, and I have felt that in several of John's buildings, and I think that is also something that we should almost constantly aspire for. Out of all of the discussions about function and budget and all of that, yes, you want to resolve to all of those, that the building or the architecture must do one other thing, and it is something that is otherwise completely irrational and emotive, almost something that is grabs you by the balls, basically.
Well, that's great. I mean, I just think we've just got into a really fascinating place right at the time. We could do a whole second lecture on this. I mean, that idea where architecture has those moments that are sort of unspeakable, unknowable, and sort of richly and personally interpreted is sort of that territory that I think both of our practices really enjoy. What I would say, I think we've all witnessed today something that's wrapped around all of the projects that Nader has talked about, is this acute logic. But it's logic as an invention rather than a sort of an established truth. And so what he's doing here is wrapping something that is generally specific to a particular project. It's a set of guidelines or rules which allows others to come in onto the project, both his staff, the contractors, the client, as is this sort of invented logic that actually holds the journey of the project in its entirety intact. And it actually is the establishment of something that is completely inventive, but establishes a set of principles, this wrapped around the term logic, which is actually misguided that it's a truth. It's often a complete invention, but it is somehow takes then carriage of the entirety of a project as its whole. We found that particularly instructive and illuminating, and the benefit to our practice in that first collaboration particularly was the means by which we now communicate design discussion within the practice, and actually taking probably from Nader's teaching as much as his practice, this means of crafted dialogue and the shared journey, which is very much part of the influence of that coming together of these two practices that we learn from. So thank you, Nader. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, John and Marisa. It really is a wonderful opportunity to share this platform with you.
No worries. Thank you both. I totally agree with John. I hope there's one day we could host you both here in person. I'm sure John will come one day to visit the school building that he has designed. So hopefully, yeah, there's a day we can host you both in person. But for now, thank you so much for your time, and I'll be in touch. Thanks.
Great.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks. I'll share the recording later on through Architalk website. So in case you're interested in watching that again, maybe in a week time or in 2 weeks time, we will launch our website, and hopefully you can watch them there again.
Right.
Thanks.
Bye.
نادر ممنونم، افتخار دادیم، متشکرم.